Alright, so here's my review video for Chapter 12 of the American Pageant. This is about the War of 1812, the Era of Good Feelings, and we'll start at the War of 1812 was a fight sort of for independence from Britain, further independence after the American Revolution, of course. But the war, first of all, went pretty poorly for the U.S. The nation was divided on whether or not to go to war. We saw the war hawks in Congress who really wanted it, but then there were some others like the merchants and Federalists who were a little opposed. There were failed invasions of Canada, especially on the land, like multiple campaigns were shut out and there was not much territory gained there, which was the main focus of the U.S., which made the war seem very poor in the eyes of the citizens, and there wasn't much support for it. And then we see the British later on burn D.C. and the Capitol building in an invasion, and we see the attempted capture of Fort McHenry, which is actually where the Star-Spangled Banner was written during that battle. The Treaty of Ghent eventually was signed in Ghent, Belgium. That was sort of just both sides were tired. The Europeans were done fighting their war, and they were just all warred out. So both sides decided, we'll call it even. Nobody really gained anything. All the pre-war boundaries were pretty much kept, and basically nobody won, but nobody lost. 2 weeks after the war, actually, since news traveled a little slower back then, Andrew Jackson took his troops and went into the Battle of New Orleans, which was a very important battle for him in his later years when he ran for president. It was very influential for him. And then we see, after that, the Hartford Convention of 1814, which basically put the nail in the coffin for the Federalists. It was the first time you see talks of secession in any way later used by the South to support their Civil War campaign. So, after the Hartford Convention, we see President Monroe winning in a landslide. And basically, that began what was called the Era of Good Feelings. And part of that was simply because there was only one Republican Party, no competition, anything like that. So people were feeling good, and especially one of those reasons was the nascent nationalism that was there. Everybody had a love for country that they didn't before, and there was a real uprising of that. And despite all that and the good economic times and stuff like that, there was still some growing sectionalism during this time that over time really led to the end of this era. We see debate over the American systems, the tariff and the bus. Different people had different opinions on whether or not the federal government should have so much power. And we also see the uprising of slavery as King Cotton becomes more of an important crop, and everybody in the South especially begins to sectionalize more and try to keep their way of life despite what everybody else is doing. After that, we see the Panic of 1819, which really marks the end of the Era of Good Feelings. We see people really mad at the government and didn't want anything to do with all this federal institution because clearly they weren't doing it right. And yeah, with this American system of Henry Clay, we see the tariff of 1816, which was actually a protective tariff, the first protective tariff ever used. And then we see the Second Bank of the United States, which was there to ensure financial stability and ensure credit. And then we also see internal improvements, which were really important in growing the country and moving people further out west and doing things like that. And as slavery became more and more of a problem, we see the Missouri Compromise, which basically outlawed slavery north of the 3630 parallel. And that was also where we saw the first mentionings of the Talmadge Amendment, which was basically the gradual emancipation of slaves. It wasn't really passed, nobody used it, although it was important, and especially in the idea of popular sovereignty. But we see that Missouri came in as a slave state, and Maine, which was previously a territory, Manhattan was a free state. So, and we see with this Missouri Compromise, it calmed tensions for a while, but there was still an uprising as people became more and more opposed to slavery, and there was a lot of propaganda against it. So it worked for a while, but it didn't stop it.
Another important fact of this chapter was the John Marshall Court and how that affected U.S. government over time. It really federalized the government, gave it more power, so the states really didn't have that much to do with government. The first you can see this in is the Marbury versus Madison case, which was extremely important, as you know, over time. It established a policy of judicial review, which was very important in reviewing later constitutional and unconstitutional, very important slavery, which was another idea of this time, a struggle of this time. And then we see another case, the McCulloch versus Maryland case, which basically said the state could not tax the federal government or its agencies. and this really gave a power to the government, as many of John Marshall's cases did, and helped constitutionalize or make it right that there would be a national government or a national bank of the U.S., which is very important in establishing an American economy. Then we see the Gibbons versus Ogden case, which wasn't as important as probably Roe v. Wisconsin, but it basically said only the federal government could regulate interstate trade and commerce, which is very important in, again, establishing this economy and who could do what with state power.
Another important part of this chapter was the foreign policy during this time. It was pretty stable for a while. It caused a lot of federal improvements and a lot of progress that we hadn't seen in the years before and after the Panic of 1819, when there was a lot of tension and dispute. And we see John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State during this time, was very important in making a lot of this happen in some of the treaties. He was very involved in the foreign policy. The Anglo-American Convention of 1818 between U.S. and England was very important. It basically established the joint occupation of the highly disputed Oregon Territory for 10 years, which was interesting because there was no colonization before this. There was new countries becoming part of our territory, which we wanted them out, and you can see that later with the Monroe Doctrine. In addition to the joint occupation of the Oregon Territory, we see the northern boundary of the Louisiana Purchase set at the 49th parallel, which was very interesting because we had already purchased this Louisiana territory, and we were, again, with all the disputed territory in Canada in that area, we had issues deciding on a boundary, so that's what the convention helped solve. Next, we see the Adams-Onis Treaty in 1819 when the U.S. acquired Florida. It was a very struggling process. It was difficult with the Seminole Indians and all the uprisings we see. There was a lot of conflict, and Andrew Jackson had to go down into the Florida territory and kind of settle things there. Spain had a lot of trouble with them. That's why they were willing to give it to us. And also, a less known part of the treaty was the U.S. agreed to give up some claim to Texas, which was very controversial after the Mexican War and the secession and all this. We didn't know if we wanted Texas or didn't want Texas. There was a lot of disputes over that. Next, we see the Monroe Doctrine, which during its time didn't hold that much significance or that much power, but later on we see in other areas of American history, we see the importance of non-intervention and non-colonization, which were the parts of the treaty. European nations at first regarded it with a lot of distaste and didn't really like what he was saying, didn't think we had enough military power to back it up. We were just all talk. But over time, it actually gained a lot of importance, especially with the Roosevelt corollary later on, which basically said we could intervene with other countries without advice from the government for a long time. So that was kind of interesting, the way the Monroe Doctrine was popping up later on. And later on, the Monroe Doctrine actually played an important part in Latin American affairs, as since the European nations were out of there, we became extremely focused, especially in the 1890s, time to run in, extremely focused on Latin America and our affairs with them, Canada, sort of the Western Hemisphere.
Thank you for watching my Chapter 12 Apush review video. I hope you enjoyed.